The alkali dust of the New Mexico territory rose in thick ochre clouds as Billy the Kid and his 4 riders pushed their mounts into the sun-scorched settlement of Tierra Seca. It was the drought-stricken summer of 1880, and the name of William H. Bonney, barely 20 years old, already carried more weight than any judge's decree in these lawless, sun-baked lands. The town was a parched skeleton of wood and baked adobe, silent save for the relentless whine of the desert wind whistling through the cracks in the boardwalk. Every window was a shadowed, suspicious eye. Billy, lean and deceptively boyish beneath his wide-brimmed Stetson, kept his hand near the butt of his Colt .45. His gang, Tomo Folliard, the loyal shadow, Charlie Boder, the quiet, deadly rifleman, Doc Scurlock, the brooding strategist, and Jose Chavez y Chavez, whose eyes knew every arroyo and wash in the Badlands, kept a loose formation behind him, their Winchesters lying easy in their scabbards. They tied their horses outside the one saloon, the rattlesnake's coil, the wood groaning under the weight of the beasts and the accumulated dust. Inside, the stale air reeked of cheap whiskey and spent lamp oil. The few patrons, hard-faced cowhands, and a pair of greasy-looking card sharks watched their entrance without blinking. Billy walked with a coiled grace, his spurs jingling the only sound louder than the buzzing flies. "We're looking for a clean room and a cold beer, partner, if that ain't too much trouble." Billy's voice was surprisingly soft, devoid of menace, yet it held the room static. A skinny bartender, his apron stained dark, gestured nervously toward the back. "You'll find no trouble here, Mr. Bonney. The sheriff's out on patrol." The name, spoken in that terrified whisper, confirmed their reputation had arrived ahead of them. They took a table by the back wall, keeping their eyes on the street through the grimy window. It was Doc Scurlock, the keenest of them, who first noticed the unusual commotion, a small, ragged figure sitting alone on a water trough across the street, motionless despite the midday heat. Soon enough, a little boy, no older than 10, slipped past the saloon doors, his eyes fixed only on Billy's table. He held a tattered piece of paper. He approached tentatively, his shadow long and thin on the sawdust floor. Are you the kid, Billy?" The boy stammered, his gaze darting to O'Folliard's sawed-off shotgun. "Depend on who's asking, son." Billy leaned back, a small, genuine smile flickering across his lips. "What can I do for you?" "It's Elena. She sent me. She hears the whispers of justice, sir. She needs to speak to the man who ain't afraid of the big cattle baron's men." Billy took the note. It was simple. Justice for a father's blood. The old windmill. After sundown. It was the code of the frontier, a request for a meeting away from the laws or the gang's ears. He dismissed the boy with a silver dollar, its reflection momentarily blinding. The meeting took place beneath the dying light of the desert sky, where the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and despair. Elena, the girl, was slight, her clothes too large for her frame. Her head was tilted slightly upward, an odd, unfocused angle. Billy saw it immediately. Her eyes were milky, scarred by what must have been an early sickness or injury. She was blind. "They say you're a killer, William Bonney. They say you take what you want and leave nothing but blood." Elena's voice was clear, unwavering, a stark contrast to her vulnerability. "They say a lot of things, ma'am. Mostly lies. But I draw first if I have to. What's your quarrel?" Billy's posture softened. He wasn't used to this kind of direct, innocent, moral judgment. "My father, Jesus, he witnessed a dirty deal. Land titles, cattle rustling, and a man named Sheriff Brody signing off on it. They didn't even use a rope. They used a bullet to his back, a mile outside town. They called it a range accident." A single tear, tracking a clean line through the dust on her cheek, was her only sign of pain. "And they burned his ledger. I couldn't see the faces, but I heard the jingle of their fancy silver spurs and the laugh of the man they called the Butcher." She reached out, her fingers finding Billy's sleeve, a tiny, desperate grip. "They took his life and the evidence. Now they threaten anyone who saw the smoke. I can't see the desert, but I can feel the heat of their evil. Please, I beg you for a justice that doesn't wear a tin star." Billy stood tall, the weight of the sun-baked world momentarily resting on his slight shoulders. He looked out at the vast, uncaring darkness of the desert. He saw his own past in the girl's plea, a raw deal and an unfair death. His code of honor, the one his enemies mocked but his friends respected, demanded a response. "You got it, Elena. I'm no lawman, but I know a crooked deal when I see one. A blind girl begging for justice. That's a stain on this whole damn territory." He squeezed her hand, a firm, non-romantic gesture of respect. "Tell me every name your father whispered, and every sound you heard. We'll find your justice, or we'll raise a hell the butcher won't soon forget." Back at the saloon, they pooled their money for a round of rye whiskey, the cheap liquor burning the back of their throats. José Chávez returned from a quick scout. His report was grim, delivered in low, urgent Spanish and then translated by Doc. "Dos hombres. They're not from Tierra Seca. They're sitting in the upper room of the general store, watching the windmill and the alley behind. They ride expensive horses, their guns for hire." Billy slammed his glass on the table. The noise was sharp, final. "They're watching her. They're trying to scare off the blind girl who can't even see them. That ain't just evil, that's cowardly. We move tonight. Tell the boys to check their loads. The butcher's payroll just got a target painted on it." The heat refused to break, even with the moon high, a sickly yellow orb hanging over the parched badlands. Billy, his jacket draped over his shoulder, gathered his lieutenants in a deserted livery stable, whose air hung thick with the pungent smell of hay and horse sweat. The dim glow of a single lantern cast long, nervous shadows across their determined faces. The butcher is Jedediah Stone, a cattle baron with a taste for blood and a payroll of cheap guns. He's tied up tight with Sheriff Brody. The local law's been bought and paid for. Doc Scurlock, hunched over a crude map drawn in the dirt, laid out the intelligence they'd gathered. Doc's mind was sharper than any Bowie knife, honed by years as a frontier physician and then a gambler. The girl, Elena, she named 3 men who stood over her father's body, the butcher, the sheriff, and a gunslinger called El Diablo Ramos. Ramos is the one she heard laughing, the one with the silver spurs. He's the killer. Tom O'Folliard, always restless, paced the perimeter, his hand steady on his rifle. "Ramos won't be in town. A dog like that hides behind the boss. Stone keeps him on his main ranch, the Diamond S, a fortress 20 miles north. Too heavily guarded for a straight-up fight, even for us." Billy knelt, tracing the rough lines of the town on the dusty floor with a twig. "We cut the head from the snake by cutting the body first. We take out Stone's eyes and ears in town. They watch the witnesses and keep Brody's back covered. José, you saw the 2 hired guns at the general store, see?" José Chávez, his features dark and intense beneath the wide brim of his sombrero, nodded slowly. "Sí, patron, vaqueros from the south. Too much silver on their rigs. They sit high in the store's loft, covering the street. And there is a third, a drunkard named Whiskey Jack, who guards the sheriff's office at night. Whiskey Jack is our first dance." Billy's eyes held a predatory glint. "He's sloppy, he's full of rot gut, and he's our way into Brody's ledger. Doc, Charlie, you cover the general store. Charlie, I want you in the old hotel covering the street. Doc, you circle back and take the fire escape. No noise, no witnesses. We need those 2 asleep, not dead, for questioning." The plan was a calculated risk, a surgical strike in a territory where every action usually exploded into chaos. The atmosphere in the stable was thick with the silent understanding that they were not just outlaws anymore. They were an instrument of raw, desperate justice. If we get the ledger, we get the proof. Stone can't hide behind Brody anymore. If we get the 2 guards, we get a location on Ramos before he can get wise and bolt to Mexico. Doc summarized the strategy, his voice low and clinical. "And me, Billy?" Tom O'Folliard asked, eager for the fight. "You ride with me, Tom. We pay a call on Sheriff Brody at his office. We'll be quiet as shadows until we get what we came for. If Brody resists, you use the shotgun. No second chances for a man who sells his badge for a piece of land and covers a murder. They checked their weapons with the practiced movements of men whose lives depended on cold steel and oiled mechanisms. The click of the Colt, 45's hammer being drawn back, the smooth shuck-shuck of a Winchester cycling around, these were the grim, authentic sounds of the frontier. Billy wiped the dust from his boots, adjusting his six-shooter in the worn holster. He wore a crisp, clean white shirt beneath his vest, a notorious detail, making him a distinct target, but a statement nonetheless. Remember the code, boys? No innocents, no women or children. This is about the Father, Jesus, and the truth in that ledger. Elena is counting on us to deliver. Don't make her shame this territory again. As they slipped out, melting into the desert night, the only sound was the muffled thud of their horses' hooves on the dusty trail and the soft creak of leather. The air was charged with adrenaline and the promise of impending violence. They split into their teams near the edge of town. Charlie and Doc faded left, their movements indistinguishable from the shadows. Billy and Tom rode straight, heading for the glowing window of the sheriff's ramshackle office. Just as they reached the main street, a lone figure detached itself from the deep shadow of the saloon porch. Whiskey Jack. He was swaying, but his hand was near his gun. He must have heard their horses, or perhaps the wind shifted, carrying their scent. "Halt right there! Who goes?" he slurred, fumbling for his weapon. Before the man could even clear leather, Tom O'Folliard fired a shot from his rifle, not at the man, but at the lantern hanging over the door. The glass shattered with a loud report, plunging the street into absolute darkness. Billy spurred his horse hard, plunging straight into the darkness and the inevitable chaos. The sudden noise was the alarm. The confrontation had begun, sooner and louder than planned. The sound of the shattered lantern was a gunshot heard across the silent town. Billy and Tom were on Whiskey Jack before the gunman could process the abrupt darkness. A brutal rifle butt stroke from Tom caught the mercenary flush on the jaw, sending him spiraling into the dirt, unconscious before he hit the dust. "Get the door!" Billy hissed, already dismounting. The sheriff's office was locked, but a well-placed boot shattered the flimsy wood frame. They spilled inside, the only light filtering in through the windows from the moonlight. Sheriff Brody was slumped at his desk, half-dressed, a bottle of rye and a stack of papers scattered before him. He fumbled for his badge and his pistol in the same panic-stricken motion. "What the hell is this? This is a law office!" Brody bellowed, his voice thick with fear. "You sold that law a long time ago, Brody." Billy's voice was cold, flat. He had his Colt leveled and cocked. "Where's the ledger for Jesus' land? The one you signed over to Stone? We ain't leaving until we get it." Just as Brody made a desperate dive for a hidden derringer in his desk drawer, a loud, muffled thud echoed from the general store across the street, followed by another. Doc and Charlie had succeeded. The two gunslingers watching Elena were down. "You hear that, Sheriff? That's the sound of your protection leaving the county. Now, the ledger." Tom aimed his shotgun, the twin barrels looking like two black, hungry eyes. Brody, realizing he was exposed and outmatched, collapsed back into his chair, beaten. "It's not here. Stone keeps the master ledger at the ranch. I only keep the drafts of the land transfer agreements. They're in the safe, and he hired Ramos, not me. I just did the paperwork." He pointed a trembling finger at a small iron safe tucked into the corner. Billy motioned to Tom, who quickly forced the lock with a crowbar they'd carried. Inside, the documents were damning. Brody's hand-signed approvals, the false range accident report, and the official transfer of the deceased Jesus' land to Jedediah Stone. Meanwhile, Doc Scurlock and Charlie dragged the two unconscious gunmen, bound and gagged, into a dusty back room of the saloon. Doc, his medical knowledge lending a clinical detachment to his interrogation, began his work. A splash of cold water, a slap, and one of the men, a grizzled vaquero named Miguel, was awake, spitting dust and fear. "Where's Ramos?" Charlie Baudra's question was a quiet, deadly whisper, his Winchester barrel pressed against Miguel's temple. El Diablo. He is at the ranch, Diamond S, waiting for the train shipment tomorrow, Miguel stammered, his eyes wide. Stone is bringing in more guns to protect the payroll, a full boxcar of Remington-riding bastards. The realization hit Doc and Charlie like a punch. They weren't just fighting Stone and Ramos, they were walking into a well-funded ambush. The planned confrontation with Ramos was a trap for any foolish attempt at a siege. Back at the sheriff's office, Billy had the signed, incriminating documents. Brody was whimpering, begging for his life. I did what I had to do. Stone would have killed my wife. He controls the whole territory. Billy looked down at the disgraced lawman. He had the proof for Elena, but Brody was a willing accomplice in murder. Justice on the frontier was often a simple, swift equation. You chose your side, Sheriff. When you signed that paper, you signed your death warrant. The law might not reach you, but the judgment does. Billy's voice was devoid of hate, only resignation. He raised the Colt. Tomo Folliard turned his back, unable to watch the cold execution of a coward. The crack of the shot was muffled by the thick adobe walls, a quick, ugly sound. Justice delivered. Billy and Tom rode back to the saloon. Doc and Charlie met them, their faces grim in the first light of dawn. Doc handed Billy a rough sketch of the Diamond S ranch and the news of the train. It's a setup, kid. Stone is bringing in a private army on the noon train. We got 12 hours before the ranch is swarming with mercenaries. We got the ledger, but we won't get Ramos there. Billy looked at the documents, then out at the eastern sky, which was already blazing with the merciless heat of the rising sun. He crumpled the land titles in his fist. Then we don't hit the ranch, we hit the train. Ramos will be there to secure his reinforcements. We'll meet his private army on open ground. Our ground. Charlie, ride for Jose. Tell him to meet us at the Black Mesa Pass. We got a train to derail, a butcher to carve, and a devil to send back to hell. The sun beat down with the oppressive, suffocating heat of a furnace as Billy and his gang reached the narrow, winding throat of Black Mesa Pass. This was Jose Chavez y Chavez's chosen ground, a perfect ambush point where the railway tracks snaked between sheer canyon walls, allowing no room for flanking or escape. The air was still, heavy, the tension so thick it felt like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Jose and Charlie had rigged the tracks with a small but effective charge, just enough to buckle the rails, not enough to kill the innocent crew. Doc Scurlock, perched high on the canyon rim with a long-range Winchester, had the best view. Billy and Tom waited in the shadows below, their horses hidden. "She's late," Tomo Folliard muttered, his thumb nervously stroking the hammer of his shotgun. "Frontier time, Tom. She'll come. And when she does, we make this count. Remember, Ramos is the target. We don't want a bloodbath. We want a message." Billy checked the loads on his 2.45 revolvers, his favored cross-draw setup. The whistle of the train, faint at first, then growing into a shrieking metallic wail, sliced through the silence. The locomotive, a black, monstrous beast belching smoke, finally appeared, rumbling down the track. Just as the engine hit the predetermined mark, Jose triggered the charge. A dull thud, followed by a sickening screech of twisted metal and steam. The locomotive leaned violently, its wheels grinding against the splintered ties, but it didn't completely derail. It was stopped, though, effectively barricading the pass. The boxcar doors burst open, and a swarm of gunmen, rifles blazing, poured out, taking cover behind the wrecked train. A desperate firefight erupted. Doc Scurlock's rifle sang first, picking off two men who made the mistake of showing their heads above the boxcar. Charlie Baudra laid down a heavy, suppressing fire from his hidden position. "Now!" Billy yelled, spurring his horse out of the shadows. He rode low, weaving, his twin colts spitting fire with terrifying speed and precision. The sheer audacity of the attack, a handful of men against a private army, momentarily stunned the mercenaries. Amid the smoke and the echoing gunfire, a figure detached itself from the largest group of shooters. a man in a dust-caked black coat, his expensive silver spurs glinting even through the battle haze. El Diablo Ramos. He carried a prized Sharps rifle, a long-range weapon he clearly favored, but he was forced to drop it for a more immediate handgun. Ramos recognized the young man in the white shirt instantly. "Bonnie, you crazy pup! You think you can stop Stone's plans? I'm here for Jesus, Ramos, and the truth you laughed at." Billy skidded his horse to a halt, drawing a perfect bead on the mercenary. The duel was a blur of motion and sound. Ramos, fast and deadly, fired first, his bullet tearing through the air where Billy's head had been moments before. Billy, relying on his youth and instinct, fired both Colts simultaneously, one shot high, one low. Crack, crack! Ramos staggered, a blossom of crimson appearing on his chest, but he fired a desperate second shot, which struck Billy's horse in the neck. The animal screamed, throwing Billy violently to the ground. Billy scrambled to his feet, discarding one empty Colt and drawing a fresh one. Ramos, clutching his wound, tried to steady his aim. But before he could fire, José Chavez y Chavez appeared on the canyon floor like a wraith, his ancient single-action revolver barking once. The shot was true, piercing Ramos's heart. El Diablo dropped his weapon, his silver spurs kicking up one last cloud of dust as he fell, dead. The fight went out of the mercenaries immediately. With their leader down and the shock of the ambush still in the air, they began to drop their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Justice was served. Billy, favoring his side from the fall, walked up to the train car, where he found Jedediah Stone, the butcher, cowering behind a stack of crates, stripped of his bravado. "You brought death to the territory, Stone. You killed a good man over a piece of dirt. That's a lesson that costs a life." Billy produced the sheriff's signed confession and the land deeds. The fate of Stone was swift and final, a consequence of frontier justice delivered without judge or jury, a necessity in a land where the law itself was corrupt. Days later, back in Tierra Seca, the air was different. The fear had not vanished, but the weight of oppression was lifted. The name of Jedediah Stone and his guns was already a bad memory. Billy the Kid, his arm in a sling, stood once more by the old windmill. Elena, the blind girl, was waiting. She heard the familiar rhythmic jingle of his spurs and the soft sigh of the wind. "You came back," she stated, her face tilted toward the sound of his voice. "I promised justice, Elena. I delivered. The butcher and his hired devil won't trouble this land again. Your father's land deeds are secured. The men who took them, they won't stand trial, but they paid their due. Here, Doc looked these over. They are clean now." He placed the folded official documents in her small, waiting hands. She felt the heavy paper, the seals, the ink. She smiled, a rare, beautiful thing that illuminated her scarred face. "Thank you, William Bonney. I cannot see the desert, but the air feels clean now. You are not a killer. You are the shadow of the true law." Billy simply tipped his hat, a profound sense of weary satisfaction settling over him. He was no hero. He was a killer with a code, a tool for impossible justice. "You take care of yourself, ma'am." He turned and walked away, not looking back. He met the gang on the outskirts of town. Their work was done. There were new sheriffs on the way, perhaps, but this justice was theirs alone. As the sun sank, painting the sky in fiery shades of red and violet, Billy the Kid and his riders melted back into the vast, indifferent landscape of the New Mexico Territory. He had come out of the blinding heat to deliver a promise, and now he disappeared back into it. The legend had just begun. To the few who knew the truth, the blind girl truly saw hell rise in the desert that day, a brief, violent storm of justice. And for years to come, whenever a poor man was cheated or an innocent was killed, the outlaws whispered in the shadows, hoping for a clack of spurs on a moonless night, hoping for the glimpse of a young man on a fast horse, a fleeting figure, forever a ghost or a shadow on the high desert, known only as Billy the Kid.